The first sign that something was wrong on the Ford farm was the lantern that burned past midnight, 3 nights running, in a window that faced away from the road. Maggie Ford had learned, in the 2 years since she buried her husband Thomas, that survival was mostly a matter of knowing which secrets to keep and which ones would get you killed if you kept them too long. She had also learned that the land of southeastern Kansas in the year 1878 was not a forgiving place for a woman alone, and that the town of Harlan's Creek was full of people who minded other people's business as naturally as they breathed the dry prairie air. So she kept the lantern turned low. She kept the curtains drawn. And she kept her mouth shut about the 3 families she had hidden in her root cellar and her barn loft over the last 8 months. The farm itself was not much to look at. 40 acres of flat prairie land with a creek running crooked along the eastern edge, a 2-room house built from timber that Thomas had hauled 20 miles on a borrowed wagon, a barn that needed its roof patched every spring, and a kitchen garden that Maggie kept alive through stubbornness and prayer in equal measure. Thomas had left her the land, a pair of mules named Abraham and Isaac, a Winchester rifle she knew how to use, and an account at Greer's General Store that ran to about $60. He had also left her a daughter named Clara, who was 7 years old and had her father's dark eyes and her mother's hard-headed disposition. Maggie was 31. She had brown hair the color of creek mud that she wore pinned up in the mornings and let loose in the evenings when the work was done, and she could sit on the porch and breathe. She had strong hands and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile easily, though it remembered how on the occasions when Clara said something worth smiling about. She was not a soft woman, but she was not a hard one either. She was simply a woman who had been shaped by the particular loneliness of the Kansas plains and the particular grief of losing a man too soon, and who had decided that the only thing worse than being alone was being alone and doing nothing useful with it. The decision to start the safe house had come to her on a November morning, when she found a woman named Ruth hiding in her hay barn with 2 small children and a bruise across her cheekbone the size of a man's fist. Ruth was running from a husband who had decided that the town of Harlan's Creek offered him better opportunities than the life he had built, and who had decided further that his wife and children were obstacles to those opportunities. Maggie had fed them, kept them 3 days, and then helped Ruth get on a westbound stage with a letter to Ruth's sister in Colorado. She had not planned it as the beginning of anything. But 2 months later, a different woman showed up, and then a family of freedmen who had been burned out of their claim by night riders. And after that, a young Mexican couple whose papers had been declared fraudulent by a land agent who wanted their water rights. Maggie had not advertised. She had not told anyone, but the word moved through certain quiet channels the way water moves under ice, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, utterly clear to anyone who was. She fed them all from her garden and from what she could spare from the store account. She let the men help with farm work when it was safe for them to be outside. She taught the children letters in the evenings beside the fire, while Clara watched from her corner of the room with those serious dark eyes. And she kept the whole arrangement hidden from Harlan's Creek, with the same focused determination she applied to everything else she did. The problem was that a woman running a safe house needed certain things. She needed food she did not always have. She needed medicine she could not always afford. She needed someone to cover for her when she had to make the 20-mile ride into Harlan's Creek for supplies, because you could not leave 4 or 5 frightened people in your cellar without someone keeping an eye on things. And she needed, though she was reluctant to admit it even to herself, someone who could shoot, not because she couldn't shoot herself. The Winchester was clean, loaded, and she had used it twice in the last year, once on a coyote that went after her chickens, and once on a drunk man from town who had ridden onto her property in the small hours of a Saturday morning, with the kind of intentions that men sometimes developed when they saw a widow alone. She had fired once into the air. He had left, and she had stood on the porch with her heart hammering until dawn. But there was a difference between one woman with a rifle and two people who could cover opposite ends of the farm, and she knew it. Edgar Boone arrived on a Thursday in late March of 1878, which was already the kind of day that made you feel like the sky was a conspiracy against you. The clouds had been promising rain for a week and refusing to deliver it, and the wind that came across the flats was the kind that got inside your coat and stayed there. Maggie was in the barn trying to coax one of her mules through a coughing fit when she heard horses on the road, and then the horses slowed and turned onto her property, and she came to the barn door with the Winchester already in her hand before she saw that it was just one man and a road-weary horse. He pulled up about 30 feet from the barn and raised one hand in the way that men did when they wanted to show you they were not currently holding a weapon. He was on the younger side of 30, she judged, with a face that was tan the color of old wood and a jaw that had not been introduced to a razor in perhaps 5 or 6 days. He wore a trail coat that had seen better weather than today's and a hat that had seen better decades than this one. He had dark eyes that were direct without being aggressive, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that said he was tired, genuinely tired, not just in his body but in some deeper register. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was unhurried with a drawl that sounded like it might have started in Texas. "I'm looking for work, any kind of work. I can mend fences, shoe horses, fix roofs, clear brush. I'm not picky and I don't need much." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. She had gotten good at reading men on her doorstep. "You riding through or you from somewhere near?" "Riding through," he said. "Coming up from the territories. Had a job in Dodge City that ran out, and I figured north was as good a direction as any." "What kind of job in Dodge City?" He met her eyes steadily. "I was a deputy for about 7 months. Before that, I rode for a cattle outfit out of Texas. Before that, I did whatever needed doing and paid an honest wage. A former lawman." Maggie turned this over in her mind. It could be a problem or it could be the opposite of a problem, depending entirely on what kind of lawman he had been and what kind of man he was underneath that. "I've got a mule with a bad cough," she said finally. "If you can sort him out, I'll feed you supper and you can sleep in the barn. After that, we'll see." His name was Edgar Boone. He was 28 years old. He was from a small town in Texas that he hadn't seen in 6 years and didn't particularly miss, though he missed his mother with a quiet constancy that showed up sometimes in the way he looked at the horizon. He had left Texas at 22 because the land his family had farmed for 2 generations had been bought out from under them by a rail company with a government friend, and the law had arrived to enforce the sale on a Tuesday morning, and Edgar had stood in his father's kitchen with his fists clenched, and had understood for the first time in his life that justice and law were not always the same animal. He had spent the 6 years since doing various kinds of useful work across various stretches of the Southwest. He had driven cattle and fixed fences, and worked in a livery stable, and spent 3 months as a ranch hand on an outfit near Abilene. The deputy job in Dodge City had been good, genuinely good, and he had been good at it. But the marshal he served under had taken money from a gambling outfit to look the other way at things Edgar could not look away from. And when Edgar had said so plainly, the marshal had suggested that Edgar find himself a different occupation, and Edgar had agreed that this was probably for the best. He sorted out the mule. It was a respiratory infection caught from the wet spring air, and he treated it with a chest rub made from camphor and lard that he had learned from a Mexican veterinarian in San Antonio, and within 2 days, Abraham was breathing clean again. He stayed on. The first week he fixed 3 sections of the fence along the north pasture, patched the barn roof in 2 places, and cleared a year's worth of accumulated debris from around the foundation of the house. Maggie watched him work from various distances and said little, but what she said was useful and direct, and he found himself paying attention to the sound of her voice in a way that he noted and set aside for later consideration. Clara watched him from a more obvious distance. She was not a shy child, but she was a careful one, and she spent the first 3 days conducting what Edgar recognized as a thorough character assessment. On the fourth morning, she appeared at his elbow while he was eating breakfast on the porch and announced that she had decided he was acceptable. "High praise," Edgar said. "I didn't say high," Clara told him seriously. "I said acceptable. There's a difference." He had to look away to keep from smiling. He glanced toward the barn, where Maggie was carrying a bucket toward the garden, and he wondered if the daughter had gotten that particular manner of precision from the mother, or whether she had developed it independently. He found out about the safe house on the 9th day. He had gotten up before dawn because he often did, an old habit from cattle driving days when the early hours were the only ones that belonged to you. He came out of the barn with the intention of fetching water from the well, and he was halfway across the yard when he heard a sound from beneath the ground that should not have been there. A child's voice, muffled by distance and wood and earth, but unmistakably a child's voice, speaking in what he slowly recognized as Spanish. He stood very still in the cold blue of the pre-dawn dark and listened. The voice came from the direction of the root cellar, which was set into the earth about 30 feet from the back of the house, with a heavy wooden door set almost flat against the ground and covered, he now noticed, with a piece of canvas that had been arranged to look casual. He could see, around the edges of that door, the faintest thread of lamplight. He went and knocked on the door of the house. It took 2 knocks and then the sound of feet on a wooden floor, and then the door opened, and Maggie was standing there in her housecoat with the Winchester in her hands and her hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes completely awake and alert in a way that said she had not been sleeping. They looked at each other for a moment in the gray early light. "There's someone in your root cellar," Edgar said. "I know," Maggie said. Another moment of silence. The wind moved across the prairie and carried with it the smell of last night's cook fire and the distant sound of the creek. "Do you want to tell me about it?" Edgar asked. Maggie looked at him for a long time. She was measuring him the same way she had measured him from the barn door on the day he arrived, but this time the stakes of the measurement were different, and both of them knew it. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." She told him over 2 cups of coffee in the cold kitchen, with Clara still asleep in the back room and the first light beginning to gray the windows. She told him about Ruth and the bruised cheekbone, and about the freedmen burned off their claim, and about the family currently in her root cellar, which was a mother named Esperanza and her 2 children who were running from a man who had bought their debt from a bankrupt landowner, and was attempting to enforce a kind of peonage that had been illegal since the war, but was still very much practiced in the territory below the Arkansas River. She told it plainly, without apology or decoration, looking at him across the kitchen table with the Winchester laid across her knees. When she finished, Edgar was quiet for a while. He turned his coffee cup in his hands and looked at the window where the light was growing. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. 8 months. "Alone?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. He was thinking about the cattle outfit in Texas where he had seen a Mexican family driven off land they had held for 40 years because the foreman had friends in the land office. He was thinking about the deputy job in Dodge City and the gambling outfit, and the marshal who had decided that looking away was easier than looking straight. He was thinking about justice and law and the gap that sometimes opened between them like a fault line in the earth. "I want to help," he said. Maggie looked at him very directly. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I need to be clear about what help means in this situation. I need someone who understands that this could become dangerous. I've had men come to the property already, men who were looking for the people I was sheltering. I managed them, but I won't always be able to manage alone." "I understand that," Edgar said. "I need someone who can shoot," she said. It was not a question. It was a requirement stated as plainly as she stated everything else. He met her eyes. "I can shoot," he said. "I won't pretend I like it, but I can do it and I won't hesitate when it matters." Something shifted in Maggie's expression. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something in the neighborhood of trust, or at least the beginning of it. Esperanza and her children will be leaving in 2 weeks, Maggie said. I have a contact in Lawrence who runs a boarding house and has connections to people who can help them establish properly. I need to get them there safely. I can ride to Lawrence, Edgar said. You'll need to take them by a route that doesn't go through Harlan's Creek, she said. The man who's looking for them, his name is Calvin Drury, and he has a cousin who drinks at the saloon in Harlan's Creek and would recognize Esperanza on sight. There's a road that cuts north of the creek and comes down through the valley, Edgar said. He had ridden it 2 days after arriving, in the way he always learned the geography of a new place. It adds 4 hours, but it avoids the town entirely. Maggie blinked, just slightly. He had clearly surprised her. You know that road? I rode it when I was getting a sense of the land, he said. Habit. She looked at him again with that measuring quality. Then she put the Winchester on the table and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. All right, she said. Then here is what I need from you. In the weeks that followed, the farm changed shape in ways that were invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. Edgar built a second, better hidden entrance to the root cellar that opened through the floor of the barn and could be covered with a loose board and a layer of straw. He reinforced the loft in the barn with a proper floor and a drop ladder that could be raised from inside, making it a genuine second room. He installed a simple signal system, using the position of a pair of fence posts near the road that would tell anyone watching from the farm whether it was safe to move or necessary to stay hidden. Maggie watched all of this with the focused attention of someone memorizing a new language. She asked questions that were always practical and precise. She did not thank him effusively, but when he did something well, she said so, once directly, and he found that this meant more to him than a longer speech would have. He was sleeping in the barn, which was how it had started and how it remained. There was no impropriety and no pretense otherwise, and Maggie was clear about that without ever needing to state it directly. Clara, however, had moved from acceptable to useful in her assessment of Edgar, and had started appearing at his breakfast hour with questions that ranged from how to whittle a whistle to why the mules were named after Bible characters to whether he had ever seen the ocean. I haven't, he told her one morning in early April. Have you? No, Clara said. But my papa said it was like the prairie except it moved and tasted like salt. That's a good description, Edgar said. Clara considered this. Papa was good at descriptions, she said, in the matter-of-fact tone of a 7-year-old who has made peace with something that remains absolutely not peace at all underneath. Mama says he had a poet's tongue and a farmer's hands. Edgar looked across the yard to where Maggie was spreading seed in the kitchen garden. He found himself thinking about Thomas Ford, about the man who had built this house and planted this farm and left his wife alone here with a Winchester and a daughter and 40 acres and $60. He felt no jealousy of the dead man. What he felt was something closer to respect and something else that was harder to name. They took Esperanza and her children to Lawrence on a Tuesday in mid-April. Edgar drove the wagon, sitting beside Maggie on the bench, while Esperanza and the children rode hidden under a canvas tarpaulin in the wagon bed between bundles of trade goods that Maggie had arranged as cover. The children, who were 6 and 4, had been coached thoroughly by both their mother and Maggie, and they were quiet and still the entire 8-hour journey in a way that broke something in Edgar's chest, that these small children already knew how to make themselves invisible. They reached Lawrence at dusk and found the boarding house on a quiet street near the university. The woman who ran it was named Mrs. Anita Webb, and she was a broad, calm, gray-haired woman who opened the door before they knocked, as though she had been watching the road. She took Esperanza and the children inside with a matter-of-fact efficiency that said she had done this many times. On the road home in the blue-gray Kansas dark, Edgar and Maggie rode mostly in silence. The horses moved at an easy pace, and the stars came out one by one in the enormous sky, and the prairie smelled of damp earth and new grass. How did you find Mrs. Webb? Edgar asked after a while. She found me, Maggie said. Through Ruth eventually. There's a network, it's not organized exactly. It's more like a collection of people who decided that doing nothing was worse than doing something. She was quiet for a moment. Thomas would have said it was foolhardy. Would he? She thought about it honestly. Probably not, she admitted. He would have said it was dangerous, but he would have helped. Tell me about him, Edgar said, because the night was long and the road was quiet and he found he genuinely wanted to know. Maggie turned to look at him in the dark. It was a brief look, but he felt the weight of it. Then she looked back at the road. He was a good man, she said. He came from Ohio and he had never seen anything like this land. He used to say it was too much sky and not enough shade. She paused. He died of a fever the summer before last. It went through the county and it took him and 3 others. Clara was 5. She barely remembers him clearly, which is the hardest part. I'm sorry, Edgar said. He meant it. He was 33, she said, in the simple way you said a terrible thing when you had said it enough times that it had worn smooth. We'd been married 9 years. They did not talk for a while after that. But the silence between them was different than it had been on the way out, less like the silence of strangers, and more like the silence of people who have exchanged something real. It was Clara who noticed first, because Clara noticed most things. One morning in early May she appeared beside Edgar while he was splitting wood and announced without preamble that her mother had laughed at breakfast. That's so, Edgar said, setting up another log. She laughed at something I said, Clara clarified, but she was looking at you when she did it. You were outside. Edgar split the log. Probably just the light, he said. Clara gave him the look that said she was 7 years old and not stupid. You like her, she said. He set up another log. Your mother is a fine woman, he said carefully. That's not what I said, Clara told him and walked back to the house. He thought about it. He could not, honestly, deny it to himself, though he was good at denying things to himself in general. The truth was that Maggie Ford had been getting under his skin in a gradual and entirely thorough way for the past 6 weeks, and he had been watching it happen with the resigned awareness of a man who knows he is stepping into a current and cannot quite make himself step back. It was not any single thing about her. It was the sum of everything. The way she moved through a crisis with her jaw set and her eyes clear. The way she spoke to Esperanza's children in the limited Spanish she had taught herself from a book. The way she sat on the porch in the evenings with her hair loose and her boots off, and a cup of coffee cooling in her hands, and looked at the sky with an expression that was not contentment exactly, but something more durable than contentment. It was the way she had said, without any romance or melodrama, that she needed someone who could shoot, as though it were as simple as that. He thought about the difference between something simple and something easy, and decided that he had always been better at simple things than easy ones. The trouble came in the 2nd week of May. Calvin Drury arrived at the farm on a Friday afternoon with 2 men behind him, and a look on his face that was the particular look of a man who has convinced himself that his anger is a right rather than a condition. He was a heavy-set man in his 40s with a beard that had gone gray and eyes that were small and pale and cold. He sat his horse in Maggie's yard and looked at the farm like he was appraising it. Edgar was on the barn roof fixing a loose board when he saw them coming up the road. He came down from the roof and moved to a position near the corner of the barn where he could see the yard and the house and still be mostly behind cover. He had his Colt on his hip and the Winchester leaned against the barn wall within reach. Maggie came out of the house when she heard the horses. She did not bring the Winchester. She brought a flour-dusted apron and a look of bland, polite inquiry. "Mr. Drury," she said, "what brings you out this way?" "Mrs. Ford." He did not remove his hat. "I'm looking for a woman who goes by Esperanza Vega. She has 2 children. Word is she's been seen in this county." "I see," Maggie said. "And what's your interest in this woman?" "She owes me a considerable sum," Drury said. "A debt that was legally transferred to me." "Transferred how?" Maggie asked. Her voice was perfectly steady. "Through the proper channels," Drury said, which meant through no proper channels at all. "If you're harboring her, Mrs. Ford, you need to understand that there are legal consequences for obstructing the collection of a lawful debt." "I'm not harboring anyone," Maggie said. "I'm a widow farmer with 40 acres and a mule. I don't have the room." One of Drury's men shifted in his saddle and looked toward the barn. Edgar held still. "You mind if we look around?" Drury said. The politeness in his voice was a thin skin over something considerably less polite. "I do mind," Maggie said pleasantly. "I mind quite a lot. This is my property, Mr. Drury, and you do not have leave to search it." Drury's jaw tightened. He looked from Maggie to the barn and back. "I hear you've taken on a hired hand," he said. "I have," Maggie said. "He's around somewhere." "Around somewhere," Drury repeated. He was looking at the barn now. His instincts were clearly good enough to feel a presence even if he couldn't see one. Edgar stepped around the corner of the barn. He kept his hands at his sides, not near the colt but not far from it either. He walked across the yard with a loose, unhurried stride and stood beside Maggie. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he said. Drury looked at him. The assessment was quick and professional, the look of a man who had assessed a lot of other men. Whatever he saw in Edgar, it gave him a moment's pause. "Just having a conversation with Mrs. Ford," Drury said. "Sounds like the conversation was about wrapped up," Edgar said mildly. "Road's the way you came." The silence that followed was the kind that'd wait. Drury's two men shifted. Drury himself sat very still, running the calculation behind his cold, pale eyes, and Edgar watched him run it and held his gaze and let him come to the only reasonable conclusion. Drury turned his horse. "I'll find her," he said, to no one in particular or to everyone in particular. He rode back down the road with his two men following, and they did not look back. Maggie let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for the duration of the conversation. She did not move for a moment. Then she turned and looked at Edgar. "That will not be the end of it," she said. "I know," he said, "but Esperanza has been in Lawrence for 3 weeks. By now Mrs. Webb will have her on the next stage of the network. If Drury has money, he can hire better trackers than those two," Maggie said. "He might," Edgar agreed. "But right now all he's got is a county to search, and this county is 40 miles wide." Maggie nodded. She was quiet for a moment, and he was close enough to see the tension in her jaw and the way she was pressing her fingers together, and he had the strong impulse to put his hand over hers, which he did not act on but filed away. "You didn't hesitate," she said. "No," he said. "Most men hesitate when they're facing 3 of someone else's." "I know," he said, but he was running a calculation. "I just had to make the calculation come out wrong for him." She looked at him for a moment that was longer than a practical moment needed to be. Then she nodded again and went back inside. That evening, after Clara was asleep, Maggie came out to the porch and found Edgar sitting on the steps looking at the stars. She sat beside him, close but not touching, and they sat in the comfortable silence that had been growing between them for weeks now. "What made you stop here?" she asked. "That first day." "There are other farms on this road." He thought about how to answer honestly. "The barn needed its roof patched," he said, "and you looked like you needed help. That wasn't charity." "You could tell that from the road." "I could tell that from the way you came out of the barn with a rifle," he said. "A woman who comes out of a barn with a rifle is a woman who's been managing alone long enough to stop expecting help." Maggie was quiet. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The night was still cool, the way Kansas nights stayed cool even into May. "Thomas used to say I was too self-sufficient for my own good," she said. "He sounds like he was a smart man," Edgar said. "He was," she said. "He was also right. Being self-sufficient is a good way to survive. It's a bad way to live." The words settled in the space between them. Edgar looked at the sky. She looked at the sky. Neither of them moved. "I should go in," she said after a while that was not a short while. "Good night, Maggie," he said. She paused with her hand on the door. He heard her stop. He heard the pause. He did not turn around. "Good night, Edgar," she said, and went inside. The next person to arrive at the Ford farm came in the last week of May. His name was James Hartley, and he was a freedman in his 50s who had been walking for 4 days from the direction of the Cherokee Strip, where he had been working as a laborer on a ranch that had stopped paying him 2 months ago and had started making threats when he complained. He arrived at dusk, cautious and exhausted, having been directed to the Ford place by a woman in the small colored settlement east of Harlan's Creek who had heard the name on the quiet network. Maggie fed him, cleaned the blisters on his feet, and gave him Thomas's old coat. She installed him in the barn loft with a clean blanket and enough food for a week, and she and Edgar sat up that night at the kitchen table working out the next step. "He can't stay longer than 2 weeks," Maggie said. "If Drury comes back and finds him here, it gives Drury exactly the kind of excuse he's looking for." "There's a Freedmen's Bureau office in Topeka," Edgar said. "It's a long ride, but they have legal resources that could help him establish a formal work contract that would give him protection." "Do you know anyone there?" Maggie asked. He did, in fact. He had worked briefly alongside a bureau agent named Charles Whitmore during his time in Dodge City, a precise and dedicated man who had navigated the particular difficulties of Reconstruction-era Kansas with more patience than Edgar could have mustered. He wrote a letter that evening, in the careful hand his mother had taught him, explaining James Hartley's situation and asking for Whitmore's help. The letter went out with the Weekly Post rider. 3 days later, a reply came back. Whitmore would see Hartley and had a contact on a farm north of Topeka that needed a reliable worker. He could have legal documentation drawn up within the week. Edgar took Hartley to Topeka in the first week of June. It was a 4-day round trip, and Maggie managed the farm alone in his absence with the steady competence that was simply her nature. But when Edgar rode back in on a bright June afternoon, she came out of the kitchen to meet him in the yard in a way that she hadn't done before, and there was something in her face as he dismounted that was not entirely about relief at having another set of hands. "Hartley settled?" she asked. "Settled and legal," Edgar said. "Whitmore's a good man. He'll make sure the contract holds." She nodded. She was standing close enough that he could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, earned by sun and squinting and too many mornings of worrying about too many things. He thought they were among the most honest things about a face that was altogether honest. "I'm glad you're back," she said quietly, looking at the horse rather than at him. "It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all." "So am I," he said. She looked at him then, just for a moment, direct and clear and entirely unguarded, before she nodded once more and went back to the kitchen. He stood in the yard with his horse and the June sun on his back and felt something rearrange itself in his chest. Clara found him at the fence that evening. She was getting to be a comfortable habit, appearing at his elbow with her assessments and her questions in her father's dark eyes. "She checked the road 4 times while you were gone," she told him. "Is that so?" Edgar said. "I counted," said Clara, who would have made an excellent surveyor. He looked at her sideways. She was picking at a splinter in the fence post with focused attention. "Clara," he said carefully, "what would you think about things changing here, on the farm?" She worked at the splinter for a moment. "Depends what kind of change," she said. "Good change, I hope." She was quiet for a bit. Then she said, "Papa told me once that the farm would always be the farm, that it wouldn't stop being his farm just because things changed." She got the splinter out and looked at it. "I think about that sometimes." "I think that's right," Edgar said. "I think so too," Clara said. She flicked the splinter away. "I also think Mama smiles more than she used to." She walked away toward the house in her matter-of-fact 7-year-old way, leaving Edgar at the fence with the evening light on his face, and a feeling that was somewhere between courage and terror. He talked to Maggie on a Saturday evening in mid-June after supper, after Clara was in bed, on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, and a sky that was doing everything it could in terms of sunset, which in Kansas in June is considerable. He had rehearsed nothing. He had learned in 28 years that rehearsed speeches tended to fall apart on contact with real situations, and Maggie Ford was one of the realer situations he had encountered. "I've been thinking," he said. "You do a lot of that," she said, without particular inflection. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that whatever you say, I intend to keep being here and keep helping you do what you're doing. My staying is not conditional on your answer." She turned to look at him. In the last light she was very beautiful in the way that people are beautiful when they are absolutely themselves and not performing anything. "All right," she said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I care about you," he said. I've been trying to find a more elaborate way to say that, but I can't seem to locate one. I care about you and I care about Clara and I care about this farm and what you're doing here, and I don't want to be here only as the hired hand who can shoot. I want to be here because this is where I belong." He paused. "I think you might feel something like that too, but I could be wrong, and if I'm wrong I'd rather know than not." Maggie looked at him for a long time. The sunset was finishing its work behind them. The first stars were appearing. "You're not wrong," she said. It was quiet and it was certain, and it was the most purely Maggie thing she could possibly have said. He reached across and took her hand carefully, the way you take hold of something valuable. She looked down at their hands and then back at him, and for the first time since he had known her she looked young in a way that had nothing to do with age, young in the way that people look when something they had closed a door on quietly opens again. "I'm not an easy woman," she said. "I want you to know that going in." "I know that," he said. "I don't want easy, I want honest." "You'll get that," she said with the ghost of something that was becoming a real smile. "Good," he said. "I can work with that." She turned her hand over and held his. They sat on the porch and watched the stars come out, and it was not a dramatic thing and it was not a small thing, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and neither of them needed to. Calvin Drury came back on a Tuesday in late June, and this time he came with 5 men and a piece of paper that he claimed was a court writ authorizing a search of the property. Edgar was not in the yard when they arrived. He was in the barn, and he heard the horses and positioned himself inside the barn door with the Winchester. Maggie went out to meet them. She read the writ carefully, because she read everything carefully, and while she was reading it, Edgar slipped out the back of the barn and came around the far side of the house so that when Drury's men looked toward the property's perimeter, they would find a man with a rifle standing at each approach point, which is what they found. There was only one man with a rifle, but he moved quickly enough that this was not immediately obvious. "This writ is dated 3 weeks ago," Maggie said, handing it back to Drury. "And it specifies a property in Caddo County. This is not Caddo County, this is Ellis County." Drury looked at the writ. Something crossed his face. He had either been given bad paperwork or he had procured bad paperwork and hoped she wouldn't notice. Either way, he was now standing on a widow's property with a legally invalid search writ and a man with a rifle visible at the tree line to the east. "I want this woman found," Drury said. He was talking to Maggie but looking at the tree line. "Then I suggest you find a competent attorney and obtain the correct paperwork for the correct county," Maggie said. "Until then, Mr. Drury, good day." He left. He left angrier than he had the first time, which was both good and bad. Good because he had not searched the property, bad because angry men with money had resources that patient men without purpose did not. That evening, Edgar sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and a piece of paper and worked through the problem systematically. Drury had tried legal channels, sort of. He had tried physical intimidation. He would presumably try something more direct next. "He knows Esperanza is not here," Maggie said, sitting across from him. "He's been tracking her too long. He knows she moved on weeks ago. What he wants now is to shut down the supply line." "Meaning you," Edgar said. "Meaning this farm," Maggie said. "If he can discredit me in Harlan's Creek, or have me arrested on some trumped-up obstruction charge, or simply make it dangerous enough that people stop sending anyone here, he wins. He doesn't need to find Esperanza specifically. He just needs to close this door." Edgar thought about this. It was a more sophisticated strategy than he had given Drury credit for, and it suggested that the pale-eyed, heavy man was more dangerous than he had initially appeared. "We need witnesses," Edgar said. "People who know what you're doing here and can speak to the nature of it if it comes to a legal challenge." "I've been doing this in secret," Maggie said. "That's the entire point. You can't do it in secret and have witnesses at the same time," Edgar said. "But you can have selected witnesses, trusted ones, people whose word in the county carries weight." Maggie was quiet, turning this over. "Mrs. Anita Webb would speak for the network," she said slowly. "She has connections in Lawrence and knows lawyers who handle Friedman's cases. And there is a preacher in Harlan's Creek, Reverend Amos Cole. He knows." He's been quiet about it because he didn't know whether to help or not. If Cole speaks publicly, even once, about the kind of work this farm does, it changes the character of a legal challenge against you, Edgar said. It makes it look like what it is, a man with money trying to suppress legal charity. They worked on it through the evening. By the time the candles were burning short, they had a plan that was not perfect, but was considerably better than the one they'd had before, which had been no plan at all. The Reverend Amos Cole was a tall, thin man in his 60s, with a voice that was larger than he was, and a conscience that had apparently been giving him trouble in the weeks since he had looked the other way on certain activities. He came to the farm on a Thursday afternoon in response to a carefully worded note from Maggie, and he sat in the kitchen and listened to the full accounting of what the Ford farm had done over the past 8 months, and his face went through several expressions, none of them comfortable. "You should have come to me," he said finally. "I considered it," Maggie said, "but I wasn't sure which way you'd jump." He accepted this without offense, which told Edgar something useful about the man. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to know the truth of this so that if it is challenged, you can speak to the true nature of it," Maggie said. "And I need you to know that what I am doing is lawful. I am not harboring criminals. I am providing shelter to people who need shelter. You are also disrupting a system of debt collection that certain powerful men in this county are financially invested in," Cole said. He was not accusing her. He was being precise. "Yes," she said, "I am." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll support you," he said, "openly if it comes to that, and there are 2 or 3 other men in town who would as well if they understood the situation." After he left, Maggie sat at the table for a long moment. Edgar poured her a second cup of coffee and set it in front of her. "You're building something," he said, "not just a safe house. An actual network." She looked at him. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's a much better thing." She smiled. It was a full smile this time, the kind that reached her eyes and changed her whole face, and he felt it the way you feel a change in weather. The full crisis arrived at the beginning of July. It was a hot, still evening, and the air smelled of summer grass and distant rain, and there were 3 people in the root cellar. A young woman named Dottie, who had fled an abusive situation in Missouri with nothing but a carpet bag, and a determination that was almost uncomfortable to witness, and a freedman couple named Henry and Grace, who had been trying to reach relatives in Nebraska, and had run into trouble with a local militia that patrolled the county line demanding papers that were legally not required. Edgar was fixing the pump handle by the well when he saw the riders coming. There were 7 of them this time, and they were not riding in the careful, deliberate way of men who intended to have a conversation. They were riding in the way of men who had been given permission to do something they had already wanted to do. He covered the distance to the house in about 10 seconds. 7 riders, he said through the kitchen door. "Drury's men, I think. They mean business." Maggie's face was completely controlled. She had the Winchester in her hands before he finished the sentence. "I'll send the signal for the cellar to stay locked," she said. The signal system Edgar had built included a piece of red cloth that, when hung from a specific nail on the porch post, told anyone inside the root cellar to stay put regardless of what they heard. Maggie put the cloth out. Then she and Edgar positioned themselves, Maggie at the front of the house, Edgar at the corner of the barn. The riders came into the yard and Drury was among them, but he was not the one who spoke. The one who spoke was a younger man on a gray horse who introduced himself, with a flatness that suggested he had rehearsed it for effect, as a deputy of the Harlan's Creek Sheriff's Office. "Mrs. Ford," the young deputy said, "we have a warrant for search of this property." "It's properly drawn up this time." He held it out. Edgar could see from across the yard that it was indeed properly drawn, the right county, the right date, signed by the right judge. Someone had spent money on a proper attorney. Maggie took the warrant and read it. She read it twice. Edgar watched her jaw, because her jaw was how you read Maggie Ford's mind when her face was otherwise composed. "What is the basis for this search?" she asked. "Complaint from Calvin Drury," the deputy said. alleging the harboring of a person in violation of a legal debt agreement. A debt agreement of what nature? That's not specified in the warrant, ma'am. The warrant just authorizes the search. He was not a bad young man, Edgar thought. He was doing a job he had been assigned and he was uncomfortable in it. But he was here and behind him were 6 men who were not uncomfortable at all. Maggie looked at the warrant a third time. Then she looked at Edgar. It was a quick look, the kind between people who have learned to communicate in shorthand, and what it said was, "We cannot stop this search." Edgar gave her a small nod. He was thinking ahead to what they could do, and what they could not do, and what the most important thing was, which was not the property but the 3 people in the cellar. "You can search the property," Maggie said. "But I am going to insist that you and I accompany the searchers together. I am not going to allow unsupervised access." The deputy nodded reasonably enough. Drury's eyes behind him were pale and cold and satisfied. They searched the house first, both rooms, the cellar stairs, the kitchen larder. Nothing. Then the barn. Edgar stood at the barn entrance and watched the men moving through the stalls, climbing to the loft, prodding the hay with pitchforks in the particular enthusiastic way that men with pitchforks tend to do, and he found himself breathing with concentrated deliberateness. The second entrance to the root cellar opened under a specific board in the third stall from the left, under a layer of straw that had been undisturbed for 2 months. One of Drury's men found his way to the third stall. He poked the hay. He poked it again. Edgar was beside him in 2 steps. "There's nothing there but old hay," he said. The man looked at him. Edgar looked back. The man moved on. They found nothing. The young deputy was clearly both relieved and faintly troubled by the whole exercise, and as they left he paused near Maggie and said, quietly enough that Drury could not hear, "Ma'am, he's going to keep trying. I just want you to know that." "I know," Maggie said. "Thank you for the warning." After they were gone, Maggie and Edgar stood in the yard in the last of the afternoon light, and neither of them spoke for a full minute. Then Maggie said, "I need to get Dottie and Henry and Grace out of here within the week. Drury knows this is an active location now. He'll find a way to watch it." "We should do it soon," Edgar agreed. "And we should use different routes for each person." "I'll write to Mrs. Webb tonight," Maggie said. She started toward the house, then turned back. "Edgar, yes. What you did in the barn with that man in the stall, you didn't flinch." "No," he said. "I noticed," she said. The look she gave him was brief and precise and warmer than anything she had said directly, and he carried it with him for the rest of the evening. The 3 people were moved successfully over the following 4 days. Dottie first, in the company of a farm wife from a neighboring settlement who was traveling east and had been recruited into the network by Mrs. Webb. Henry and Grace on the day after, by way of the northern road to Lawrence. Edgar rode the second trip himself, through a night that was cool and clear and enormous with stars, while Maggie kept the farm and Clara slept, and the county lay quiet and unknowing around its secrets. By the second week of July, the cellar was empty and the barn loft was empty, and the farm looked like nothing more than it appeared to be. 40 acres, 2 mules, a creek, and a woman trying to make a living from the Kansas soil. Drury did not come back. This was partly because Edgar had ridden into Harlan's Creek in the 3rd week of July and paid a visit to the county land office, where he had, with the particular patience of a former deputy who knew how records worked, identified 3 separate irregularities in the debt transfer documentation that Drury had used to establish his claim on Esperanza's family. He had then taken this information to Reverend Cole and to a lawyer in Lawrence whom Mrs. Webb had recommended, and the result was a formal complaint filed with the territorial court that put Drury in a very precarious position regarding his entire debt collection operation. It did not destroy Drury. Men like Calvin Drury had a way of surviving challenges, but it made him expensive enough to maintain that he redirected his attention elsewhere, and he was not seen at the Ford farm again. The summer deepened, and the farm found a new rhythm. They were not yet what they would become, Edgar and Maggie, but they were moving toward it with the steady purpose of people who know where they are going even if they have not said so in exact words. They worked the farm together in the mornings, and handled the safe house logistics in the evenings, and sat on the porch at night with their coffee cooling in their hands. And the conversations they had were the conversations of people becoming familiar to each other in the deepest sense of that word. She told him about her life before Thomas, about growing up in Indiana with a father who built furniture and a mother who kept bees, about how she had come west because Thomas had wanted to and she had been willing to be persuaded, and had ended up more in love with the land than she had ever expected to be. She told him what she missed about Indiana, which was mostly the trees. Kansas was not a country of trees. He told her about Texas and his family's farm and the rail company and the Tuesday morning that had changed everything. He told her about the various jobs and the various places and the deputy work in Dodge City and the marshal who had taken the wrong money. He told her that he had spent 6 years looking for something that felt like it mattered without being able to name what that something was, until he turned up a dirt road in Ellis County and found a woman coming out of a barn with a rifle. "You make it sound very romantic," she said. "It wasn't romantic," he said. "You were pointing that rifle at my head." "I was pointing it in your general direction," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Fairly large difference," he agreed. "I appreciated it at the time," she laughed. He had been making her laugh more often lately, carefully and without trying too hard, and each time it happened he felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has discovered that the best joke is the one that sounds like the truth. He asked her to marry him on a morning in August. It was not an evening, not a sunset, not any of the theatrical settings that the occasion might have called for. It was a Thursday morning, and they were pulling weeds in the kitchen garden side by side, and the sun was already hot, and the air smelled of turned earth and green things, and Clara was somewhere in the back of the garden talking to the mules through the fence in the earnest way she had. He sat back on his heels and looked at her and said, "Maggie, I'd like us to get married." She stopped pulling a weed. She sat back on her heels too and looked at him, and the morning sun was on her face and her hair was coming out of its pins as it always did by mid-morning, and there was a smear of garden dirt on her cheek, and she was absolutely beautiful and absolutely real. "I've been thinking about it too," she said. "Have you?" "For a while now," she said. She looked at her hands. "I was trying to figure out if I was being practical about it or romantic about it." "What conclusion did you reach?" "That it's both," she said, "and that both is better than either one alone." He reached over and took her hand, dirty from the garden, and held it. "I love you," he said. It was the first time he had said it in exactly those words, and it landed in the still morning air with a kind of clean finality, like the last piece of something fitting into place. She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were bright. "I love you too," she said. "I've been trying not to let myself, and then I was trying not to let it show, and then Clara told me I wasn't very good at either and I decided to stop trying." He laughed. She laughed. Somewhere at the back of the garden, Clara appeared over the tops of the tomato plants and surveyed the scene with the expression of a general whose campaign has concluded successfully. "Finally," Clara said, with 7-year-old frankness. They were married in September by Reverend Cole, in the small white church in Harlan's Creek, on a morning that was cool and golden with early autumn light. Maggie wore a dress of blue wool that she had made herself over the previous 3 weeks, working in the evenings after Clara was asleep, and she had done her hair herself in the careful way she did it for occasions, pinned up with 2 tortoiseshell combs that had been her mother's. Edgar stood at the front of the church in his best clothes, which were clean and pressed and about as good as they were going to get, and watched her come down the aisle of the small church with Clara walking beside her as her only attendant, holding a bunch of late-blooming prairie wildflowers that she had gathered herself that morning, and his chest did something that he had no interest in describing in any clinical way, because some things deserve to just be felt. Mrs. Anita Webb came from Lawrence for the ceremony. having received Maggie's invitation with what she described as considerable delight. Reverend Cole performed the ceremony with the full sincerity of a man who felt, in some way he could not entirely articulate, that he was doing his most useful work of the year. A small collection of Harlan's Creek residents filled the pews, some of them people who knew pieces of the story and some of them people who simply liked Maggie Ford and were glad to see her happy. When Cole said, "You may kiss your bride," Edgar cupped Maggie's face in both hands, and she put her hands flat against his chest, and they kissed in the way of people who have been waiting to do something properly and have earned the moment. Clara clapped, enthusiastically and slightly too early, and the congregation laughed, and it was exactly right. The autumn after the wedding was the quietest the farm had been in months, and they moved into the quiet together like they had been doing it for years. Edgar took Thomas's side of the bedroom and found, in the careful, unsentimental way Maggie had arranged it, that there was no ghost there, only a room that needed new curtains and got them. He was now a farmer in a way he had not been since Texas, and he found to his genuine surprise that he had missed it. He liked the particular rhythm of it, the way the land told you what it needed if you paid enough attention, the way a well-managed farm had the quality of a long and honest conversation between a person and the earth they worked. He and Maggie made decisions about the farm together, which was different from how it had been before, and both of them found the difference to be entirely in its favor. The safe house kept running. If anything, it became more organized in the autumn and winter after the wedding, because Edgar's contacts from his deputy days and Maggie's contacts through Mrs. Webb and Reverend Cole combined into something that was more robust than either had been alone. They had a rotating set of people they trusted to provide a night's shelter, to provide a wagon ride, to provide legal counsel or medical care, or just a reliable word. The network was never public, never announced, never put in writing in any form that could be used against them. But it was real and it functioned. And over the winter of 1878 into 1879, it helped 9 families and 11 individuals find safe passage to places where they could begin again. They were careful. They were careful the way you learn to be careful when you have done something risky for long enough to understand exactly where the edges are. Calvin Drury was still in Ellis County, but he was occupied with his legal troubles and had not been seen on their road since July. The young deputy from the summer search came by once, in October, and had coffee in the kitchen and spoke privately with Edgar, and they came to the kind of understanding that is possible between two men who are fundamentally decent and are not going to pretend otherwise. Clara turned 8 that November and conducted her birthday party with the organizational precision she applied to everything, assigning specific duties to both Edgar and Maggie with the confidence of a general staff officer. She had begun calling Edgar Papa in October, on a morning when the 3 of them were at the breakfast table, and it slipped out naturally in the middle of a sentence, and she stopped and looked at him, and he looked at her, and they were both very still for a moment. "Is that all right?" she asked. She was trying very hard to be nonchalant and not quite managing it. "That's more than all right," he said. She nodded briskly and finished her sentence, but she was smiling at her porridge for the rest of the meal. Maggie, who had heard all of this from the stove, said nothing. But when she turned around to bring the coffee pot, there were tears on her face that she was blinking away with the no-nonsense efficiency of a woman who has decided that she is allowed this one moment and will not be embarrassed by it. By December, Maggie knew she was pregnant. She told Edgar on a Saturday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the fire going, and the snow coming down outside the window in the slow, deliberate way of early winter snow that means business. She told him plainly, in the way she said everything, watching his face as she did. He went very still. Then he stood up and came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took her hands and looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before, something unguarded and luminous and slightly overcome. "Maggie," he said, and said nothing else for a moment because there was nothing else that needed saying. She put one hand on his cheek. He turned his face into it. They sat like that for a while, with the fire crackling and the snow coming down and the farm quiet around them, and it was the most peaceful thing either of them had felt in a long time. Clara received the news the next morning with a calculation that briefly reminded Maggie of a magistrate weighing evidence. "Boy or girl?" Clara asked. "We don't know yet," Maggie said. "I'd prefer a brother," Clara said thoughtfully. "I already know how girls work." Edgar bit the inside of his cheek. Maggie managed barely to keep her face composed. "We'll see what we get," she said. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was hard in the way that Kansas winters are periodically hard, with weeks of cold that settled into the bones of the house and required the fire to be fed through the night. Edgar was up before dawn most mornings to tend the livestock, coming back into the kitchen cold and stamping his feet, and Maggie would have coffee ready, and they would sit together in the early gray light before Clara woke and talk about the day, about the farm, about the things that needed doing and the things that could wait. It was the plainest possible domestic life, and he could not think of a thing about it that he would change. There was one more significant crisis that winter, arriving in February like the particular cruelty that February specializes in. A family of 4 arrived in a near-desperate state. A couple named William and Harriet Baines with 2 young children, freedmen who had fled a violent confrontation in a town 60 miles south, where a local militia had burned 3 buildings in the colored section of town, and several families had scattered in the confusion. William Baines had a wound on his arm from a buckshot graze that Maggie cleaned and dressed with the steady hands and calm instructions of someone who had done field medicine before, and was not going to be distracted by the fact that she was also 6 months pregnant. They stayed for 3 weeks, which was longer than ideal, but the winter roads made faster movement risky. Edgar organized their eventual departure through a contact in Nebraska, a former cattle driver he had known in Texas who had settled into farming and was willing to vouch for the Baines family to a land agent he trusted. Harriet Baines cried when she left and held Maggie's hands in both of hers, and said something that Maggie did not repeat to Edgar, but that made her eyes bright for the rest of the day. The spring of 1879 came early, the way it sometimes does in Kansas, with a rush of warmth in March that smelled like hope and made the creek run high and clear. Maggie's condition was impossible to disguise by then, and she moved through the kitchen and the garden with the unsentimental practicality of a woman who has decided that being pregnant is a condition of life and not an excuse to stop doing things. In April, Edgar bought from a neighbor 3 new acres of bottom land along the creek that had better soil than what they had, and he plowed it himself in the first warm week and planted it in corn and sorghum. He was building the farm with the same deliberateness he had built everything else, adding to it year by year, as a man does who intends to stay somewhere for a long time and knows it. On a May morning, early enough that the sun was still pink and the dew was still on the grass, Maggie went into labor. Reverend Cole's wife, a capable woman named Martha Cole who had midwifed half the babies born in Ellis County in the last decade, was there within an hour and took charge of the situation with brisk authority. Edgar was expelled from the bedroom with the directness that the situation warranted and spent the next 4 hours on the porch doing absolutely nothing useful in a focused and intense way. Clara came and sat beside him at one point and put her hand in his without saying anything. "I'm fine," he said. "I know," she said, "but I'm sitting here anyway." He put his arm around her and they waited together while the sky brightened and the birds started up, and the farm went about its business as it always did, indifferent to the momentous thing happening inside the house. The boy was born at 9 in the morning on a May day in 1879. He was healthy and loud and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's set of the jaw, and when Martha Cole placed him in Edgar's arms and stepped back, Edgar held his son and felt something in him that had no name that he knew of, something that was larger than love and more permanent than happiness. Maggie watched from the bed with her hair damp and her face exhausted and entirely joyful. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like you," he said. "He's got your chin." "That's going to be a problem for him," she said. He laughed carefully so as not to disturb the baby and crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she leaned against his shoulder and they looked at their son together in the May morning light. "What shall we call him?" she asked. He had been thinking about this. "Thomas," he said, "if that's all right with you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him with an expression that was past words, that was simply everything at once. "Yes," she said. "Thomas Edgar Boone." She tasted the name. "That's a good name for this land." Clara, admitted at last from the hallway, came and stood on her tiptoes to look at the baby with the concentrated scrutiny she applied to new information. "He's very red," she observed. "He'll improve," Maggie said. "He's quite small," Clara noted. "He'll improve on that too," Edgar said. Clara studied the baby for another moment. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied by the overall evidence. "I'll teach him things," she decided. "He'll need to know how the farm works." "He will," Maggie agreed. "And how to read," Clara added. "And probably how to use a rifle eventually, since everyone here seems to think that's important." "Eventually," Edgar said. "He's about 7 hours old at the moment." "I know that," Clara said. "I'm making a plan." She turned and walked out of the room with the air of someone who has a great deal to organize. Edgar and Maggie looked at each other. The baby made a small, dissatisfied sound and then decided against it. "I think we're going to be all right," Edgar said. "I think we've been all right for a while now," Maggie said. "We just kept being too busy to say so." He kissed her forehead. She closed her eyes, holding the baby, and the morning light came through the curtains and fell across the three of them in the particular golden way of May mornings in Kansas, which is to say, with a generosity that the land reserves for its best days. The summer of 1879 was the full flowering of everything that had been growing on the Ford farm, which was by this point the Boone farm in the mouths of those who knew it, though Maggie had kept the name Ford on the deed, and Edgar had not suggested otherwise, because Thomas Ford had built the foundation, and it seemed right and proper that his name should remain on it. The safe house continued its work through that summer and into the fall. They were not naive about what it could accomplish. The Kansas plains in 1879 were still a place of considerable injustice, where the machinery of law and the reality of power did not always align, where freedmen could be dispossessed, and Mexican families could be driven from water they had farmed for generations, and women could be returned to dangerous situations by courts that valued order over safety. They could not fix this. They could not change the architecture of it. What they could do was this specific thing, in this specific corner of Ellis County, and do it carefully and well, and they did. The network that had grown from Maggie's original one-woman operation now included 7 farms, 2 town households, Reverend Cole's church, Mrs. Webb's boarding house in Lawrence, and the former deputy, whose name was Martin, who had left the Harlan's Creek Sheriff's Department in the summer, and had taken a position with the county court where he could ensure that warrants were properly drawn and legally sound. He turned out to be a useful ally in ways that exceeded what Edgar had initially hoped. Calvin Drury left Ellis County in the fall of 1879. The legal challenge to his debt collection operation had widened, through the efforts of the Lawrence lawyer and a territorial judge who had grown tired of certain kinds of complaints, and he had found it expedient to relocate to somewhere with fewer complications. He was not imprisoned, which was not justice, but he was gone, which was relief, and the farm breathed easier with him gone. By the autumn of 1879, Thomas Boone was 5 months old and had developed a personality that was approximately equal parts his mother's and his father's. He was serious and observant like Maggie, and he was also good-natured and stubborn about physical challenges like Edgar, and the combination produced a child who would fix you with a stare of disconcerting directness, and then cheerfully attempt to pull himself upright using whatever was nearest, regardless of whether it would hold him. Clara had appointed herself his primary educator, and was already teaching him the names of things in the farm with a patience and consistency that exceeded what most 8-year-olds were capable of. She reported his progress to Maggie and Edgar at the breakfast table with the air of a supervisor delivering assessments. On a November evening, after the baby was asleep and Clara was doing her letters at the kitchen table, Edgar found Maggie on the porch in her shawl in the cold evening air, looking at the sky the way she sometimes did, with that expression that was more durable than contentment. He came and stood beside her and followed her gaze up into the enormous Kansas dark, which at this hour and in this cold was pure and brilliant and deep. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Thomas," she said. "The first one." She said it with the ease of someone who has learned to carry something heavy without letting it crush her. "He would have liked you." "You think so?" "I know so," she said. "He was a man who recognized good character. He didn't have much patience for anything less." She paused. "He would have liked what we've made here. He would have been proud of it." Edgar put his arm around her and she leaned into him. The stars were extraordinary, the way stars get in November when the air is cold and clean and the sky has no mercy about its size. "I keep thinking about next spring," she said. "More land, maybe, if we can manage it, and I want to expand the kitchen garden. I've been thinking we could build a second root cellar deeper with better ventilation for the safe house work." "We could do that," he said. "And I've been thinking about a second barn. The cattle drive market is changing. There's money in it if you work smart." "Practical," she said. "I learned from the best," he said. She laughed, tipping her head back. He looked at her laughing in the cold November night, and thought that there was nothing in the world like the sound of Maggie Ford Boone laughing at the Kansas sky, and that he had been lucky beyond any reasonable expectation to have found himself on this road at this time with this particular woman. She turned and looked at him, and in the starlight she was the same woman he had ridden toward on that gray March morning, competent and clear-eyed and carrying a metaphorical rifle, ready to meet whatever came. And she was also something else, something that she had let herself be because she had decided he was worth the risk of it, warm and open and genuinely happy in the way that people are happy when they have built something real. "I love you," she said, simply, directly, the way she said everything. "I love you," he said. They stood together on the porch for a long while, in the cold and the starlight, with the farm quiet around them and the baby asleep in Clara's lamplight visible in the window and Abraham and Isaac settled in the barn and the creek running dark along the eastern edge of the property, and the enormous Kansas sky overhead doing what the Kansas sky does best, which is to make you feel small and necessary at the same time. The years that followed were good ones. The second cellar was built in the spring of 1880, deeper and better fitted than the first, and the network continued its quiet work through the decade. They expanded the farm to 60 acres by 1881 and added a second barn and 12 head of cattle that Edgar managed with the competence of a man who had spent years learning from the best practitioners of that work. Maggie continued to run the safe house with increasing sophistication, and by the middle of the decade, the operation she had started with a single frightened woman in her hay barn had become, without ever advertising itself, one of the more reliable stations on the informal network that moved vulnerable people through central Kansas toward safety. Martin, the former deputy, eventually became a county judge and exercised his position with the kind of scrupulous fairness that made certain powerful men uncomfortable and a great many less powerful people considerably safer. He and Edgar remained friends in the no-nonsense way of men who respect each other's work without needing to talk about it much. Mrs. Webb lived to see the decade turn, still running her boarding house in Lawrence, still opening her door before visitors knocked, still organizing the next steps for people who needed them. Clara grew up to be exactly what she had always promised: sharp, direct, kind in the practical rather than sentimental way, and thoroughly capable of running a farm, a safe house, or any other organization you might care to hand her. She was studying in Lawrence by the time she was 15, and came home in the summers and at Christmas, and brought with her books and news and a permanently questioning mind that kept the dinner table at the Boone farm both lively and slightly unpredictable. Thomas, the younger, proved to be everything that his parents had hoped, and several things they had not anticipated. He had his mother's stubbornness, and his father's patience, and his sister's intelligence, in a combination that was quietly formidable. By the time he was 4, he was following Edgar around the farm with the focused attention of an apprentice. And by the time he was 6, he was doing actual useful work rather than the pretend kind, because the Boone farm had always operated on the principle that useful work was not too much to ask of anyone who was capable of it. In the spring of 1882, Maggie was pregnant again. This time she told Edgar at the breakfast table, with Clara home from Lawrence for Easter and Thomas on the floor building something architectural out of wooden blocks. Again. Clara said with the frankness that had never deserted her. Again, Maggie confirmed. Clara considered this. I suppose there's room, she decided. Thomas looked up from his blocks with the dark Ford eyes he had inherited whole. Baby, he said. Baby, Edgar confirmed. Thomas appeared to weigh this. Good, he said, and went back to his blocks. The second child was a girl, born in October of 1882, named Ruth after the first woman Maggie had ever sheltered in her hay barn. A quiet, private acknowledgement of the decision that had set everything in motion. Ruth Boone was dark-haired and loud, and had her father's easy manner and her mother's fierce will, and she completed the family in the way that people feel complete when the last piece of something important has arrived. Edgar Boone stood on his porch on a clear October evening in 1882, with the harvest in and the air smelling of autumn and wood smoke, with the baby sleeping in the house behind him and Thomas at his feet, and the sound of Maggie and Clara talking in the kitchen carrying through the open door. He was 32 years old. He was standing on land he had helped build into something worth standing on. He was married to a woman who had come out of a barn with a rifle and turned out to be everything worth finding, and who still sometimes did exactly that, rifle and all, because some things about Maggie Boone remained unchanging and should. He thought about the road he had been on when he turned up this particular dirt track, the Texas farm lost to the railroad, the years of various useful work, Dodge City and the marshal who had taken the wrong money, the gray March morning and the barn door and the decision to knock. You could call it luck. He was inclined to think it was more specific than luck. He was inclined to think it was the particular consequence of two people who had both decided, separately and for their own reasons, that doing the right thing was worth doing even when it was difficult, and who had happened to find each other at a moment when both of them needed exactly what the other one had. Maggie appeared in the doorway. The lamplight was behind her, and the evening was cool, and she had Ruth on her hip and her hair coming down as it always did in the evenings. "Supper," she said. "Coming," he said. She looked at him with that look she had, the direct and certain look that had been one of the first things he had recognized in her and was still one of the most characteristic. Then she smiled fully, the smile that had taken weeks to earn and which he had never since grown tired of. He picked up Thomas, who was sleepy on his feet, and carried him inside. The door closed behind them. The lamplight glowed in the windows. The farm settled into the quiet of an autumn evening on the Kansas plains, and it was a good quiet, the kind that comes from a day well used and a life honestly built, and it held everything that mattered inside its frame. 2 children and a farm and a network of people doing the right thing quietly and without announcement, and a woman who had turned her grief into something useful and her farm into a sanctuary, and a man who had driven up a dirt road looking for work and found, instead, the place where he was supposed to be. The stars came out over Kansas as they always did, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the lamp in the Ford Boone farmhouse window burned steady against the dark.